I welcome everybody to this 2025 World Bee Day webinar. I'm very happy to be with you. I'm Fiona Chambers I'm the CEO of the Wheen Bee Foundation, and this webinar is brought to you today courtesy of Wheen Bee Foundation and the Bee Friendly Farming Program. We're thrilled to be able to have joining us Stefan Vogel. In fact, Tim and Danny, if you'd like to just share your cameras with us for the moment, just so we know that you're there. We've got three speakers. We've got Stefan Vogel from Rabobank, we've got Danny Feuvre from RaboBank, and we've got Tim Jackson from the Almond Board of Australia. So the way today's going to work is we will commence with about half an hour, just over half an hour of presentations. So Stefan will commence, and then we'll run with Tim, and then finish off with Danny. And we will have a Q&A session at the very end. So if you've got questions, if I'd invite you to put your questions down the bottom in the Q&A, you'll see a little Q&A tab. So if you could post your questions throughout the presentations in the Q&A tab, and then we'll address those questions at the very end. So thanks. I'll get Danny and Tim to turn their cameras off for the time being. I'd also, before I introduce Stefan to you in more detail, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I'm coming to you from today, and acknowledge the traditional owners past and present. So I'm coming to you today from Goolagin country in southwest Victoria, and I'd encourage you to just put in the chat function where you're coming to us from today. We've got people from all over Australia joining us. So good morning to those from the West Coast, people from the West Coast of Australia, and good afternoon to those from the East Coast of Australia. So what we know is in Australia, hive demand since 1990 has tripled, and the number of commercial beekeepers of hives and commercial hives available have hardly changed at all. And we know that we're going to have increasing demand for pollinators in the coming years. So this webinar is all about how we're going to manage that, particularly in the light of the recent Varroa incursion that happened 3 years ago now. So this webinar is really around how Varroa might impact Australian pollinators and what we're going to do about it. So recently, Rabobank published a report called How Varroa Might Impact Australian Pollinators. Stefan and his team are the authors of that report. And so we're very pleased to have Stefan with us today to share with us the outcomes of that report. So over to Stefan. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Fiona. I'm happy to start, and let me fire up my slides. So hopefully you can see the slides in a second popping up. And I'll put hide here. Yeah, we did a little bit of work to look into what we may have to think about in terms of the demand going forward for pollinators, but also how Varroa could impact us by looking at other regions. First of all, before I go there, as a bank, I have to do this to you. This is public in nature, and obviously I don't know your personal circumstances. So with that, please do not consider any of what I'm saying here as financial advice, but rather think that this is forecast and they're reasonably held, at least at the time of when we made them, with all the information that was available. With that, let's dive into the content. And if we're looking at the demand of hives, and you look at the line here, we've taken the acreage of certain crops that require pollination services. So, for example, almonds, but also several other tree crops over the time, and looked at the acreage and estimated how many hives you may need per hectare. And then if you overlay this, as Fiona said, with the hive numbers we have commercially, but also in the recreational space, we see that there's quite a bit of a misalignment in terms of the growth has been strong on the demand side, but hasn't been very strong on the supply side. That's already something to manage going forward. The good news clearly has been, before we have seen Varroa roaring his head here in the country, we have seen a bit of an increase in hives. So hopefully we don't see a reversal of that trend. With that, the question is a bit, where do we see the problems in the sector? So let's look a little bit at the margin side of the beekeeping. And if we're taking the revenues and the cost over the last few years, we actually have seen that the profit may have just about been stable for quite a while. But however, if we're looking at what we anyway had without Varroa mites, so we had clearly an increase in many things that we're touching day to day. So inflation has been high. We've seen wages increasing. We've seen the cost of energy being still very expensive these days. But on the other side, we've also seen a bit of pressure from the prices on the honey side, for example, also due to imports. On the Varroa side, on top of that, obviously now comes extra working hours to treat the hives for any kind of Varroa mites. We also have to think about the costs that come not only because of the man hours, but everything else related to Varroa mites. So with that, we actually look at it and think, well, the honey and the wax price might not go much higher from here, but may face some pressure when the costs are increasing. Clearly, the concern might be on the margin side, and that's usually what drives professional businesses out of business. So clearly, we need to keep an eye on margins and avoid that we see too many businesses go away from beekeeping, given we need the beehives going forward. If we're looking at what else can we do to think, well, how could the situation may evolve? And there are a few regions in the world. We had North America and Canada, especially, but also New Zealand as examples of the impact that we have seen in those regions. So maybe starting off, and if we're looking on the left side, that's the Canadian side, and US is not much different. We have seen actually a quite steep reduction, especially in the number of beekeepers, but also the number of hives have declined in that decade after the outbreak. Clearly, that was early on. So we're talking here about the mid-'80s, early on in the development of Varroa mite. The treatments weren't as good as they are today. So with that, maybe and hopefully we don't see anywhere of a decline as we did in the Canadian and North American regions. But even if we're looking just about 20 years back into the right picture here, New Zealand, even there we have seen the number of beekeepers, but also the number of hives declining in that decade after. A much smaller decline, obviously, in the number of hives, only around 10%. But even that is something we couldn't afford. And clearly, if you think about New Zealand, also there, the growth has returned, which is the good news because of the growth in horticulture. So that we may want to compare us more to New Zealand than the North American side, but even there, I may not think we're going to get a 10% reduction as long as the margins in the pollination service stay high. Now we also need to think, how can we take some of these numbers and model it into what we may see here on the Australian side? So if we would, first of all, look just at the demand picture, and especially that period when a lot of the tree crop like almonds are in the pollination phase, we are looking at a continued growth, not only up until now, but also for the next 5 years or so. We see a lot more acreage maturing in terms of almonds and other tree crops. With that, our estimates are for that seasonal period of July to October, probably an increase from an area of 600,000 hives that we meet up to something like 800,000 hives in that period. So still a continued strong growth that we're expecting here in the region for pollination services. Now the question is, if we take the bees and we look at where they are, clearly we need the movement of bees to continue. You know that during the almond pollination season, we need quite a bit of hives moving into Victoria. So that's the first prerequisite that still needs to stay in place for the years to come. No matter how many hives we have across the country, there will likely be always a shortage in Victoria in that pollination period, and we need to get quite a bit of hives across borders from the neighboring states and also Queensland into the region. So if we would take the demand side and you look at the bars here, especially in that July to October period, what we think the demand is up until 2030, and we now look at what would happen if we just take the numbers, the last known hive numbers, and we take a reduction of 10% like we had in New Zealand, that's the top line, or we take a number like in Canada, that is the bottom line. Obviously, we would run into problems rather quickly here. That is just the commercial hives. So we can also think, well, there are also quite a bit of recreational hives and smaller beekeepers out there. So if we're taking that number, there's a bit more buffer in the mix. However, also there, we need to see a growth of beehives to not run into problems in the next couple of years, given that we have still a strong growth ahead of us in the pollination demand. So with that, no matter if we face a smaller reduction or if we're just going sideways in terms of hive numbers, we would still, in the next 5 years, probably get close to the needed volumes of hives, which is a picture that is not very pleasant. So we need to see an increase probably in terms of pollinators going forward to get our pollination done. So maybe with that, let's think about what can we do to get the pollination somehow to those that still need it. So clearly companies in the horticulture space, and especially those that already today pay for pollination or organize their own pollination, need to have a decent strategy in place how to evaluate and work going forwards with the situation. So from that angle, if we're looking at the outlook for a tighter situation, clearly those that have companies that come over and provide pollination services, you may want to stay close to them. You want to make sure that you have a good communication and that overall both sides are happy with that business relationship, because down the road when things get tighter, usually you want to be able to call them up and hope that they show up at your almond farm or your plantation rather than at somebody else's. Some companies think about even ownership, and we've seen several investing in that business and running their own bees and pollination services. Clearly, that is something that can help, at least to have the bees on the ground. However, it clearly requires a certain skill set. It is also partly not what the core business of those companies is. So with that, it might not fit every company, but it is something to think about. We can think about native bees and other insects that could get involved in the pollination. So making your farm more attractive obviously is something that can help, be it by planting some attractive crops that bring those native insects over and then also get them into the almonds and other crops. However, that might not be enough. We can think about mechanical pollination. We have seen all kind of technology evolving. However, most of the time, the bees that we have in place just do it much more economically than the mechanical side of things, so that the most crops that probably will remain something for the longer term future rather than for the immediate future. But also on the crop breeding side, we clearly see that several crops are moving down the path of self-pollination. So something to look into, but clearly with many of the crops that have been planted and maturing, or the crops that are in the ground and are tree crops and will stay in the ground for a long time, that doesn't really help there. But for overall, a strategy is still also worthwhile to think about the breeding side. Maybe I keep it really short with that, and thank for your attention for now, and resume later on again in the questions and answers. So with that, back to you, Fiona.
Thanks, Stefan. Thanks so much. And I'd encourage people to keep the questions coming through. So we've got a heap of questions at the end. So I'll ask Tim to come forward now, and you can start sharing your screen. Stefan, if you just go on to closing off your video now. Tim, I'll just introduce you while you're starting to share your presentation. So Tim is the CEO of the Almond Board of Australia. And obviously the almonds in Australia are one of the single biggest industry that really needs bees for pollination and is so completely dependent on honeybees in particular for pollination. So it's a key focus for Tim and his industry. Tim's also a member of the Mallee Regional Innovation Centre Strategic Advisory Panel, and contributing to research and innovation in the Horticulture Centre. So thanks, Tim.
So thanks very much, Fiona, and much appreciated. The Almond Board of Australia represents nearly 100% of the almond industry, which is predominantly grown in the Southern Murray-Darling Basin across New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia. As you can see there, our planting we've gone through some phenomenal growth. So our needs back in 2000 were very small in regard to bees, 3,500 hectares. But we currently sit at about 66,000 hectares. We're about to confirm that later this month and heading towards 70,000 hectares. it's interesting to note that a lot of those orchards will at least almost 40% of those orchards will need to be replaced in the next 5 to 7 years. So a lot of traditional setups in industry in orchards where there's been a nonpareil and a pollinator in their structure is being reviewed at the moment. As you can see there, the majority of our production is in the Sunraysia, on both sides of the river. Riverina is now the second largest with a significant portion, nearly 25% of our production. And you'll see I've got a cross next to Adelaide. By next year, Adelaide Plains will no longer be a growing region. It's been swallowed up by urbanisation. If we look at the tonnage timeline, we originally, not that long ago, with the hectares in the ground, were predicting we would be producing over 200,000 tonnes of almonds. But in more recent times, it's become clear that some of those ageing orchards are not producing as predicted, and that our production will level out in the next 4 to 5 years. And then after 2029, as I said before, we have significant replanting to occur, so our production will drop off, and so will our hive requirements, given the fact that we'll have much younger orchards in those areas that have been traditionally the engine room of the industry. We've also had some issues with yield. As you can see here, the green yield is this year's prediction. Pre-harvest estimate was 155. It looks like it's going to fall short of that, just as it did last year and the year before significantly. So we've got some issues around production. And of course, in 2023, we had the Varroa no borders, and some pretty ordinary conditions. So the impact of not having enough bees couldn't be measured accurately because we had such a terrible climatic season. This is a really interesting slide because it does underline this area here in 2005, 2006, 2007 was the explosion of our industry. We were very small, a boutique industry. Corporate investment came in, and by the end of that decade, we had 30,000 hectares and a much bigger use for beehives from right across Australia. And then again in 2016, after some historical high prices, more corporate investment in our industry, and we doubled in size once again. So it's these orchards back here that look like they're tiring quicker than everyone anticipated, and they'll need to be replaced in the next 5 years. From a pollination point of view, grower behaviour, there's certainly an increased accountability for beekeepers. We're seeing the number of frames and the health of hives being monitored, growers employing people to check hives to ensure that what's being delivered was what was promised, and in some cases are rejecting some hives if they don't match up with the promise before they were delivered. There is certainly an adoption of technology to help monitor hive health before they arrive on site to ensure that to provide growers with some confidence, especially large growers who've got multiple farms. They're looking for that transparency to ensure that the significant investment in beehives is being backed up by what's being delivered. Due to an increased cost of production, we're also seeing some growers are governing their stocking rates by not how many they believe they need, which is 4 to 5 hives per hectare. It's been governed by cost because we've seen a significant increase in costs, well, not only on pollination, but in most other areas of growing. There's also an increased interest in self-fertile varieties. It's still a very small part of our industry, but certainly like California and other areas, the grow almonds, the self-fertility of some varieties has been looked at as a serious option given the cost of pollination when replants occur in the next 5 years. Currently, our estimated hive requirement is over 300,000 hives at an estimated cost of 60 million plus. If you look at this gives you a really good picture. When we were at 3,500 hives back, 3,500 hectares, The cost of a hive was about $30 or just over. People are paying 180 to 200, and we're hoping that that levels off this year. That is a phenomenal amount of growth that has reflected the demand for hives and quality hives in our industry. We are by far the highest, I believe we're about, Danny can correct me, but I believe we're the highest paying industry for hives per year for pollination. Just on an almond board point of view, we were the biggest contributor to the Varroa mite response. We're currently paying off $5.4 million levy against almond growers as a signatory to the Emergency Plant Pest Response Deed. We've also provided countless hours in additional in-kind support as a member of various working groups through that national response. We work closely with Dan and the ARBIC team around outcomes to ensure things like business continuity are continued, because a beekeeper's business continuity is closely linked to an almond grower's business continuity. We're certainly advocating for a broader cost sharing model on all things around biosecurity, and that includes, as I say down there, around some of the affected industries who some have got very small proportions estimates on their reliance on pollination. It'll be interesting to see where that all falls in the time to come as the feral bee population is wiped out by Varroa mite. Interestingly, just to finish off, Fiona, we are currently doing a benchmarking program of which pollination costs and stocking rates will be an important part of that, and that should be a program that gets going later this year. And we also have not only a benchmarking but a guidance for growers. We've launched our own Almond Hort 360, which is a portal which allows growers to check whether they're at best management practice or below. So that's a bit of an overview for you, Fiona.
Fantastic, Tim. Those who don't know Danny's the CEO of the Australian Honeybee Industry Council, which is the national peak body for beekeepers in this country. He's been a commercial beekeeper for 15 years, providing pollination services across South Australia. He's the founding director of Australian Bee Services, currently director of AgriFutures Australia, a member of Hort Innovation Expert Advisory Panel, and is the deputy chair of AgriFutures Australia, and is on the Australian Manuka Honey Association. So Danny knows a lot about what's happening in the bee world. And so what we're doing is we've had Stefan talk about, with his crystal ball, looking back, looking at what's happened with other countries and what experiences we can possibly bring forward. Tim's given us an overview of what's actually happening in one of our major industries that's impacted by pollination in Australia, and Danny's now going to talk about what he's seeing from the bee side of things, what's actually happening now. Over to you, Danny. Thanks very much. You're on mute, Danny.
Yeah, got it now. Thank you. Thanks, Fiona. Thanks for that introduction. A bit dated. So currently full-time working for the Australian Honeybee Industry Council. As Fiona said, we're the national representative body for the honeybee industry, and we deal with the national issues like national biosecurity. So been very involved in the Varroa response from the start. There's a few things I just wanted to highlight that are what I see as unique challenges in Australia, especially when it comes to the Varroa incursion that we're seeing. I know Stefan talked about profitability of beekeepers, but on our most recent data we have, the profitability of the Australian beekeepers is very low at the moment. It's driven very much around farm gate price for bulk honey that's being paid. And in fact, most of our beekeepers are probably at break even at the moment. When you look at the incursions that occurred in New Zealand, they came on into a Manuka gold rush shortly after their incursion, so that drove a lot of profitability in their industry. They actually saw a big explosion in hive numbers based on the Manuka gold rush as well. The US is another common one we look at to compare ourselves to, and once they had Varroa mite, they also had a burgeoning pollination industry, and in the US, beekeepers are able to string a pretty big chunk of their season together with just pollination events as a primary income source, moving from the south of the United States through to the north. We can't quite do that in Australia. As Stefan said, we predominantly have most of our pollination dependent crops flowering in a very short window, sort of between August and October. The Varroa mite that we found in Australia is absent of some of the key viruses that we know really impact beekeepers around the world, most notable of which is deformed wing virus. We're yet to find that in Australia, so we believe we're free from deformed wing virus. And we know when deformed wing virus interacts with Varroa, it really exacerbates the impacts of Varroa mites on honeybees. However, we do have a number of endemic viruses in Australia currently. And what we don't know is how those existing endemic viruses are going to interact with Varroa as Varroa establishes across Australia. And so that's something we're watching really closely. Small hive beetle is another pest that we have endemic in Australia, but in countries like New Zealand, it's absent. And in the US, they didn't find small hive beetle until 20 years after they found Varroa. So we're very much managing Varroa before that came in. In Australia, we're seeing small hive beetle populations explode along the coast, particularly along the coast of New South Wales, where Varroa is established. The Varroa seems to come in and really weaken the hive, and then small beetle just comes in and finishes the job off. So that may significantly change the impacts we see. The other one is feral honeybee densities. So we know in Australia from peer review work that the feral honeybee populations in the Australian landscape can vary between 50 hives per square kilometre up to 150 hives per square kilometre. If we looked at somewhere like New Zealand when they had their incursion 25 years ago, their populations were estimated to be around 20 hives per square kilometre. And that does a couple of things. Not only does it create issues once those feral bees disappear from the landscape for the horticultural industries that have really depended on that free or feral bee pollination services over the years, because that will largely disappear. But it also exacerbates Varroa as it moves through the country because there's no management of those feral honeybees. They host Varroa, allow Varroa to breed up, and those Varroa move very quickly back into managed colonies as those feral bees die off. So that reinvasion of the colonies makes it very difficult for commercial beekeepers or any beekeeper to manage Varroa in those hives. So just to touch on the profitability in the industry at the moment. So this, the far right column is talking about the farm gate prices paid to beekeepers when they're selling in bulk, generally to a packer. A decade ago, it was sitting at $3.60 per kilogram. We had a few years there at $6.50, which was quite profitable. As a result, we saw a lot of new entrants in the industry. We saw a lot of hives increasing. But then just in recent years, we've seen that price really drop off to 23, 24, where it was $4.90. In fact, the most recent data has seen it drop even further than that, and we're down to $4.20 to $4.50 a kilogram farm gate. And as a rule of thumb, most beekeepers' cost of production is around that $4 a kilogram. So the beekeepers are doing it pretty tough at the moment. Profits are marginal, and that's before they have to deal with paying for Varroa treatments. So we're doing a lot of work to try and improve the situation. There's a lot of factors doing that, but everyone online here can help us and help beekeepers directly just by making sure they buy 100% Australian honey from wherever you buy your honey from. And that just ensures that we don't have any surplus stock sitting in Australia of Australian honey, and we can get a bit more competitive pricing at the farm gate for our beekeepers. Now, just to talk to the current situation of Varroa and where it is. So the picture there of New South Wales, the orange, the darker the orange, the higher the density of Varroa mite. So you can see that it's very much centred around Sydney and Newcastle in the original detection areas. But you can also see a pretty light splattering of colour right across New South Wales. So we're pretty confident that the majority of beekeepers in New South Wales have Varroa mite to some extent. Potentially it's still at very low levels across much of New South Wales, but we are hearing more and more beekeepers reporting that they're finding it in their hives. Certainly around Newcastle, Sydney area, they are copping the brunt of it at the moment. The Varroa populations are increasing in those areas. It's into the wild honeybees or the feral honeybees in those areas. And in fact, around Sydney, we're getting a lot of reports of the feral honeybees disappearing from the landscape. A example we always point to is University of Sydney, who had mapped the feral bees around the campus. They're now reporting that all those feral bees have disappeared, and beekeepers that have kept bees in those areas all their life are reporting the absence of feral honeybees in the landscape. So we're starting to see those impacts that we predicted. We're also seeing huge impacts on the beekeepers themselves in those areas. They are starting to see the impacts on the colonies, starting to lose hives and starting to have to really ramp up the treatments and hive protections to protect from Varroa. Varroa has moved right up the coastline of New South Wales now, up to the Queensland border and all the way down to the Victorian border. In fact, if you look at the Victoria map, there's now 7 or 8 detections in Victoria, albeit very low detections, but we are expecting more of those to increase as we move through the rest of this year. The little map there is of Brisbane, quite hard to see, but that's Brisbane. There's just been a recent detection in the last few weeks in the Lockyer Valley and in the Brisbane city region as well. So we're seeing mites move across the Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria. There's been no detections in South Australia as yet, but we are very keen to still see beehives moves. Our policy at RBIC is to slow the spread, not prevent the spread, and we need, the majority of our beekeepers need to be able to move across borders to be able to survive financially. And the slowing the spread efforts has really worked. As Fiona said earlier, we're 3 years nearly since the detection, and we're only just seeing it spread into different jurisdictions now. So I just want to touch on some of the early impacts we're seeing from Varroa. These are graphs that have come from the National Varroa Mite Management Program from Nadine Chapman. This is monthly hive registration data for New South Wales. The top 2 graphs are talking about commercial beekeepers. So on the left, we can see leading into 2022, a steady increase in commercial beekeepers, which we have seen for the last 5 or 6 years, a steady increase of hives and beekeepers. Then once Varroa is found, we've seen those registered beekeeper numbers starting to fall right through 2022, 2023, which the eradication program finished towards the end of 23, and then into the transition and management program through 24 and into 25. That's also reflected in the hive numbers. There is a big drop there, which is probably reflective of the eradication program and the euthanasia of sub-hives. But we also know a lot of those beekeepers had re-established their hives as well. So there's some significant drop in hive numbers there. The bottom 2 graphs are looking at recreational beekeepers. It's very much the same story. Leading into 2022, we're seeing huge growth in recreational beekeeping. And then as the eradication program failed to eradicate Varroa, we started seeing recreational beekeepers deregister out of New South Wales. And again, that's reflective of the hive numbers for the recreational sector. So there's been nearly 50,000 colonies not on the register in New South Wales over the last few years. But given that we know it's in the very early stages and very much concentrated along the coastline of New South Wales at this stage, we're expecting this might be the tip of the iceberg as we see it move across New South Wales. We are anecdotally also seeing a record number of businesses for sale, but we are also seeing the start of some industry consolidation. Some of the bigger players are buying out the smaller operators and growing in size, which is very much in line with what we've seen in other countries with Varroa established. We're also seeing some bigger beekeepers restructure their businesses, so drop their hive numbers to cater for the extra labour that it takes to control Varroa and make sure they've got that strong buffer in place. So the impacts we're seeing are real. They are what we talked about right from the start. That is the reason why there was such an effort placed on eradication, because we knew the impacts would be severe on the industry. But our beekeepers are resilient. They've been through many droughts, fires and floods and pandemics as well, and survived and come out the other side. So our beekeepers all have a tough few years whilst Varroa establishes in Australia, but then once we get through the initial establishment phase, the mites will be much easier to manage for those beekeepers. And just like we've seen around the world, we'd hope to see a resurgence in the industry in the more the medium term. So Fiona, that's it from me. A quick update of where we're at currently.
Thanks, Danny, for that. And if I get Tim and Stefan to just turn your cameras and we'll start going into the question phase. I mean, I think what we wanted to do was give everyone an opportunity to hear everyone's point of view. So we've got a really good picture of the potential of what might happen based on what other countries have seen and what we're actually seeing 3 years in, what we're actually seeing. So all the questions I'm going to deal with through the Q&A chat. So if you could put your questions in the Q&A rather than putting your hands up, that would be great. What I want to start, Stefan, I want to throw to you first and just look at the figures and give you an opportunity to talk to the figures around perhaps what was not included in the data. So you've looked at a whole lot of things. You've drawn from North America, America and Canada, and then also New Zealand. But what's not included in the report? Let's because I'm sure people are going to be going, well, what about? So
yeah. Look, a whole lot of things are not included, but I think the biggest thing that is probably not included is there are a lot of horticulture industries that are not organizing and paying for their pollinations, and with that rely actually on what Danny discussed here also a bit is the feral bees, the native pollinators. So with that, obviously, if we're thinking about all the products that are beautifully lined up in the supermarkets where we walk in and see the shelf full, there's a whole lot from apples and so on that usually use insects that are available in the nature. Clearly, there's a big question mark what happens to some of those if we see the feral bees declining. Some might not be very quickly able to explain why their yields might not look good until they may or may not see that, oh, I didn't have the pollination going as strong as I wanted. So with that, clearly, we looked at the companies and the industries that requires the pollination services, so the tree nuts and especially the almonds in our projections, but there's much more behind it. So with that, I think the other part that probably is not heavily included here is obviously the number going forward of the beekeepers. And I saw one of the questions also here, did I hear about the survey in Sydney and heavy drops? I think it's not only the exit that we need to think about, and Danny nicely showed the latest numbers, but it's also those that were thinking about coming in, now not coming in. I'm German. As a child, I really wanted my dad to get into bees, and we didn't do it because of Varroa mite. And from a recreational perspective, that probably is where it suddenly moves from fun and a little bit of work to a little less fun and a lot more work. So I think that's also the part where the recreational beekeepers might actually be the ones that need to think, do I continue or not? Because suddenly it takes more time than they wanted.
thanks, Stefan. Danny, I might go to you now and just get your sense. You talked about in your presentation around the unique challenges of Australia. So I'm interested in your perception about the Rabobank report and what's been presented by Stefan around what are the similarities and differences, and where are we going to be better off perhaps, or where are we going to be worse off because of some of those differences you talked about?
Thanks, Fiona. Yeah, I suppose there's a lot we don't know. So we don't know how it's going to behave in Australia. We don't know what the impacts are going to be necessarily. So all we can do is look abroad and see what's happened there. So I've highlighted what potentially could be some of the unique challenges our beekeepers face with mites in Australia. But it suddenly occurred to me that this whole webinar has been, it's quite negative. Yes, it is scary. Yes, we have got challenges, but there's also going to be a lot of opportunities out of this, right? For beekeepers. So what we've seen overseas is a restructure of the industry. Beekeepers change their focus from perhaps primarily from honey production to the opportunities that arise in pollination. But there's also things we don't know about. We've got such high feral bee densities in Australia. If they all disappear, does that mean that there's more available nectar to make more honey from? So do our beehives start per unit, start being able to produce more honey as well, which will add to the profitability? And I think there'll be, as Stefan said, in the short term, perhaps people who are thinking about coming in the industry who might not. But in the medium term, there'll be people that identify those opportunities and will come into the industry, and they won't know any different to what life was like before Varroa. So they'll come in and just manage those hives from what they learn straight off the bat.
Thanks, Danny. Tim, question for you. So one of the things Stefan talked about was there was a range of things that we need to be looking at, and one of them was alternate ways. So you'd mentioned some of the self-pollinating varieties. To what degree of mechanical pollination or the self-pollinating varieties are they realistic options to solve the Varroa problem from your point of view for your industry? Oops, you're on mute.
Thanks, Fiona. There's no doubt that the growth in the industry has been stifled by Varroa mites arriving. Lots of people are looking at the cost of pollination as a real tipping point, given the fact that water prices now in the dry are starting to increase. But certainly pollination cost is a significant cost in the overall cost of production. So people are turning to self-fertile varieties, but there's some risk there as well because they're unproven. So whether they've got a market value that meets cost production is another issue that still hasn't been clarified as such. Certainly, there's research going into mechanical pollination. We're trialling blowflies, believe it or not, and just the early stage of pollination in August for a lot of our areas. Native bees is going to be a challenge simply because of the temperature. A lot of them. First, you've got to capture enough of them, and then you've got to have a certain time of year where they actually are active. So we've got some real challenges ahead of us, and hence the hesitancy and the slowing down of investment until there's a bit more clarity around what that looks like.
Yep. Thanks for that. Because one of my questions was going to be around we've got over 2,000 species of native bee. To what degree are they going to be part of this solution? So from the reasons that you've pointed out, it's probably not going to be a solution, or it's going to be a very small, minimal part for the almond industry. Danny, have you got a sense of some of the other industries where harnessing or augmenting those other wild native pollinators is going to be more realistic part of the solution?
Yeah, look, I think to rely just on honeybees isn't a great deal for any horticultural industry, and what we know is that the best outcomes around pollination is a good mix of pollinators, not just one species, not just honeybees. And having said that, I firmly believe that we will never be able to replace honeybees in the system just because of the way our agricultural and horticultural systems are now designed, so intensive, so large. But there's a lot farmers can do. I mean, it's a really great plug for the bee-friendly farming program, which you might be able to talk about a bit more, Fiona. I'll see it's a question in the chat. But it's really about a holistic approach from growers to make sure that the environment that they're creating on farm is conducive to all insects, not just honeybees. So if we can build background levels of insects on farms, it makes it much better for honeybee hives when they come on farm, and having that holistic approach. Are we going to be able to replace insects with mechanical? Again, even the mechanical pollination technology that I've seen will only provide pollination at a point in time. It will never eliminate having insects on farm. It will help support and augment the impact those insects are having, but I don't think it'll ever replace it. So we've got to design a system and find a way of using everything available to get the pollination job done, and try and make sure that all those systems can work in together.
Thanks, Danny. Stefan, there's another question that's come up here in response to some of your modelling. Is there an indication of where the pollination price per hive will be in the future? How's your crystal ball?
I think Tim showed some interesting numbers there with the growth of that price, but clearly if you plug in the latest honey data that Danny was talking about, and you basically cut another 60 cents or 70 cents from where my latest number was, it just gets tighter. So with that, is the 160 or what Tim showed, is that the end, or will we see more? I think the thing, I'm always looking at it from a market's perspective. And very often a 5% shortage doesn't mean a 5% increase. A 5% shortage of something very often means an overreaction of the market because people try to get the shortage to their facility or live with the pain of not having enough. So with that, I don't know where the end of the pollination can be and the price. So with that, I think there's always risks to both sides, but it can also rather quickly fall. If we're successful finding enough pollinators, we may see the price also going down a little bit again.
So the market response tends to be a bit of a rocky one where there's a shortfall.
And I'm not enough in the industry to say, oh, can you contract someone for multiple years at a certain price and so on. So there are all kind of strategies to also think about how can I mitigate my risk if I need to pay for pollination services. As I said, being close to the pollinator is probably a first very good step to say we have a good relationship. We find a way that both sides feel they are treated fair. That usually always helps when there are short-term supply and demand issues to bridge them.
Yeah, which is also where, one of the reasons why we've been working so hard on establishing an Australian pollination strategy, because there is no national plan for pollination to try and iron out some of these market fluctuations that lead to such, in some cases, difficult situations for people. Thank you. Tim, there's a question here. How long does it take to get a productive almond tree after planting?
3 years is normally the first crop, but you're really looking at 4 to 5 before you get commercial volume. So that'd be you will see an absolute downturn in production once those new trees are in the ground, Fiona, for sure. But most people are going to stagger their plantings. The other thing I'd say to the previous question, Fiona, as well, is that in the very short term, we still have a lot of uncertainty around interstate movement of hives. So there's a fair challenge there around the uncertainty. You can have a contract, but you've still got to get the bees to your farm.
Yeah, which falls into that whole national planning, making sure you got policy lined up with to make things happen that you need to happen. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, some other questions. The obvious one probably is with Varroa, is there a silver bullet? Where Varroa has been the issue that Stefan has been outlining has been more than just Varroa. It's that we were heading towards demand growth outstripping the supply availability even before Varroa became an issue. Varroa is just another layer of problem, but it's a problem that's really putting a lot of pressure on the system that was already going to be under pressure. So is there a silver bullet for managing Varroa, and if so, how far away is it? Danny?
Yeah, I'll just speak to the first bit to your question there, Fiona, about previous lack of growth in industry. One of the biggest limiting factors for our industry has been places to put bees that can keep them healthy and happy and produce honey. So access, particularly to public land and resources, has been a very big limiting factor in previous expansion. Obviously, at the moment, the beekeepers have got everything coming at them at once. We've got cost of production going up, we've got profitability, and we've got Varroa hitting them at once. Is there a silver bullet? The US have had Varroa mite now for 50 years and are still struggling, still seeing significant year-on-year colony losses, and the beekeepers are primarily pointing that to Varroa mite.
What kind of level of losses are you talking there, Danny?
So they've previously on their collar surveys been reporting sort of 30-40% colony losses. In fact, last year, and we're not 100% sure why, but there's been 60% of the colonies in the US disappear over this last winter. But it's not necessarily, there's not a lot of confidence just yet about what the exact cause of that is. It is possible that is because of Varroa. The New Zealand, who are probably a bit closer aligned to us, their colony losses have sort of been anywhere between sort of 10 to 15 to 18% annual colony losses. Again, with Varroa being the primary cause of those, and then secondary to that is queen failure, which can be as a result of some of the treatments. So the US have had it for 50 years. They've got a pretty good R&D program. They're still reliant on basic chemistry, miticides to do that. Now, we talk about in Australia how we've got some of the best researchers in the world. And we've seen a huge amount of researchers enter our industry over the last couple of years to work on Varroa treatment. So we've got a whole heap of stuff on the horizon coming. They're looking at things like botanicals, rDNA technology, a new form of targeted miticides for mites, organic treatment. So there is a lot of work happening, but there is no silver bullet at the moment. It's just going to be hard work for beekeepers, and the key to keeping it all under control is that monitoring of the hives, making sure they understand how many mites are in there, and only treating when they have to. But unfortunately, in the short term, there isn't. But we're hoping there's a lot of investment going on to try and find some solutions.
Thank you. So there's a question here from Mick asking about mechanical pollination that was mentioned by Stefan. So Stefan, have you got some specific examples of where mechanical pollination, where we're seeing that?
Well, obviously in very high value crops like vanilla, you see people even doing it with humans, pollinating the crops. You can do that when your crop is very expensive and you have the crops in a rather confined small area. We have seen other crops where drones and the likes are supporting, but probably not doing the full job. So with that, I think it always comes down to costs. And at the end of the day, that is very hard to make work. So with that, I think we need the native pollinators. We need the feral bees as well as the pollination honeybees all in the mix, and then need to think where can the technology come into play. If we look 15, 20, 30 years down the road, maybe it changes. I mean, we see artificial intelligence, machine learning all do quite a bit, but I hear these words for the last 5 years and I haven't seen anything that really impressed me so far anywhere in the food and ag space, to be honest. So yes,
Yep.
Technology gets better, but it usually comes at a cost. And with that, I think I would bet my money rather on the native pollinators and the existing technologies for now.
Thanks, Stefan. Danny or Tim, have you got a view on the mechanical examples of mechanical pollination?
You go, Tim.
The enormity of you have to have a pretty good battery at the moment. 10,000 nuts per tree, 1,000 hectares, that's a lot of trees. So I'm not sure we're going down the mechanical path. It'd be more along the lines of coming up with some sort of artificial pollen that could be applied in some efficient way. That would be something that potentially, but I'm a bit like Stefan at the moment. It comes in a white box and it does a pretty good job in August.
Yeah. Danny, have you got some examples of where you're aware of mechanical pollination?
Well, yeah, in addition to what Stefan was talking about, I mean, I've been involved in some research work over the years around, using blowers to blow pollen onto trees, comparing hand pollination to alternative pollination and all that. And like I said earlier, I don't think there's any silver bullet on the horizon for the beekeepers or the pollination dependent industries here. It's going to be trying to use all the tools that we've got available to both of our industries to try and get some solutions and work through it the best we can. I do see this as a short-term problem. Our industry will come through the other end like all the other industries in the world have done, and we'll get back to an equilibrium where we won't be under that pressure. So it's got to be a whole of system approach. I don't think we can rely on any one particular form.
Yeah. And I think to add to what you've all said, when you look at the value of crops, so if you look at protected cropping, where you've got highly intense crops, tomatoes or seed crops, maybe mechanical is more viable in those highly concentrated formats, but not on something that's really extensive in the system. Makes the viability a lot less attractive. So thank you for that question. There's also a question around, the likelihood of Varroa jumping across the ditch to Tasmania. Any sense about how soon we're going to see it jumping across either the Nullarbor, I guess, to the west, or across the ocean to Tassie? Danny?
I'll take that question, I suppose, Fiona.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have a really strong, what we call a 5-zone biosecurity policy in Australia, where we have really strong biosecurity internal constraints about moving apiary equipment and hives across certain areas. So those 5 zones includes WA as being one, Northern Territory, the northern part of WA is another, Kangaroo Island as one, Tasmania as one, and then the eastern seaboard as a 5th biosecurity zone. It's been really effective in the past of preventing endemic pests and diseases moving. So WA, for example, is still free of European foul brood. Tasmania have been free of small hive beetle. And so we've got a proven system to be able to prevent the spread of pests and diseases internally in Australia. And we've strengthened that with many of the jurisdictions putting in even tougher controls in place now Varroa's here to try and prevent the spread into those jurisdictions for as long as possible. Will it get there? It will eventually, but how long can we can hold it off? I feel that we've got a really good system to be able to do that for quite a long time.
That's some good news. Got another question here. I'm trying to get through as many as possible around the investment in IPM type, so alternate treatments for Varroa, so microbial, biological, that could potentially be used as IPM. So I don't know whether Danny or Tim.
Yeah, so there is a bit of work happening. We've got pretty limited funds within our own industries, our research and development abilities, but we've been able to see universities, Wheen Bee Foundation as well, tap into less conventional funding pots of money or pools. And so Macquarie University, for example, are doing a huge piece of work around alternative treatment methods for Varroa. And so there is that work happening. There is nothing there that's looking like the silver bullet at this stage. Again, it's just going to be a case of using all the tools available in an IPM strategy, which is a good IPM strategy, using all the mechanical, cultural control methods you got, and then keeping your chemical or miticides in reserve for when you actually get over your thresholds and start using those selectively and only as needed. But the reality is at this stage with the tools that are available for us, what we're seeing around the coastal environment of New South Wales is that beekeepers are not able to control this just solely with organics, that they are having to use those more reliable, well-known synthetic treatments to get them through those early establishment phases of Varroa. We expect once the establishment phase where the reinfestation is really severe passes, then there'll be the opportunity to be able to manage the mites like the rest of the world does, which can involve organic treatments or less hard chemicals, I suppose.
Thank you. I'm just mindful of time. I might try and get a couple of quick ones in. There's one here. Does Varroa have another host that farmers should keep an eye on? So, yeah, if you could just talk about, is Varroa going to wipe out all our native bees, Danny?
So Varroa originally evolved with the Asian honeybee, Apis cerana. It switched host to the European honeybees, Apis mellifera, some 50 years ago. Apis cerana, the Asian honeybee, had naturally developed its own defense mechanisms against Varroa, but since it switched to European honeybees, the European honeybees haven't been able to do that. We can selectively breed for tolerance of that and try and breed into some of those defense mechanisms, but they are very hard to keep in those traits in the bees, and it takes a very active breeding program to maintain that. So it's definitely possible, but it's a big investment and takes a long time. Sorry, I missed, what was the question again? Sorry, Fiona.
Oh, is it going to wipe out all our native bees? So
Yeah.
it's around, should they be worried about it jumping a host?
Yeah, so it's very specifically evolved to live on European honeybees. The way it breeds within the brood, the way it comes out and eats, feeds on the adult honeybees is very dependent on that breeding cycle of European honeybees. What we know in Australia with the Australian species that are currently there, the vast majority of them are solitary to start with. They don't have a brood, they don't colonise. And the ones that do have brood and do colonise have very different breeding patterns to European honeybees. And so there is no examples globally of Varroa mite jumping onto those types of native bees. And we have no expectations of Varroa being able to impact the native Australian bees at this stage.
So that's some good news. I'm mindful of time and I do want to wind it up there. There were some great questions. We've covered a lot. There's obviously so much more that we could cover, but I want to finish by throwing 2 questions to each of you as the panelists. First one being around, looking forward, what you see as the greatest challenge. What is the single biggest challenge that we're facing when we're looking towards securing pollination in this country. And if you had a magic wand, what would you be, how would you be encouraging people to address it? So who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
Good on you, Tim.
I'm with Danny. I reckon you've got to keep it half full, a glass half full mentality to the whole thing. Certainly from our perspective, we see opportunity. We're one of the very few industries that admit we're 100% reliant on European honeybees. There's going to be a few other industries coming to the confessional all too soon, Fiona, realising that they too are 100% reliant. So I think there's some real opportunities in Danny's industries once we go through this dip, as we saw in some of the charts that Stefan showed. It'll just be a matter of managing the costs around the cost of production. But I think that it's just a matter of getting on with it, educating yourself. We spend an enormous amount of money on the national transition to management response. So beekeepers in Australia are better trained and educated than anywhere else in the world when Varroa hit. And Danny and his team and the rest of the state governments have done a really good job of educating. So I think it's a matter of just getting on with it and coming up with the pollination areas. And I think that's probably the other thing, is that the pragmatic person part of me says we just need to acknowledge that it's an enormous part of our supply chain, and that floral resources need to be provided access so we can actually get on with feeding the nation and the global village.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tim. Stefan?
Well, look, I always look at it from a cost side of things, so I already talked a lot about the cost, but I'm looking now with a glass half full perspective. When things get complicated, the good operators usually are winning over the ones that are not as good. So control what you can control and be really good at what you're doing. And the magic wand, well, as a person, I just love a little bit of nice flowers in the backyard. I was just home at my sister's place in Germany. Half of the backyard is now native bee and insect friendly, which basically means she doesn't mow that and sowed some other things. I think she's lazy, but she found a good argument why she doesn't have to mow the lawn all the time by planting some nice crops in there. So with that, maybe think about the backyards that we have in Sydney. Do they all just need to be grass, or could we do something in our home backyards to make the bees a little bit more happy?
Thanks very much. Danny?
Yeah, going along with the glass half full theme, I think there is a lot of opportunities on the horizon for beekeepers. It's not necessarily about the bigger guys getting bigger either. I think the opportunity in finding diversified income, so beekeepers who traditionally haven't done things like pollination, and as Tim said, we're going to have more and more other industries come online in terms of pollination demand, so there'll be new and diverse opportunities for beekeepers to diversify their income. I think there's also a great opportunity for beekeepers to get to know their own businesses better during this. So beekeepers are going to have to watch their costs now. There's going to be a significant cost of production increase. Beekeepers are going to have to get to know their businesses a lot more intimately than perhaps we've had to do in the past. So there's a great opportunity for beekeepers to upskill, gain some greater business acumen, and really get close to the business. And I think there's also, what we've also seen overseas is because it does become more intensive of managing Varroa, the beekeepers tend to manage other diseases and pests better as well. So the end result here could be that we end up with healthier bees at the end of this once we get through that initial stage, because beekeepers are in the hives a lot more managing Varroa and inadvertently managing all the other pests and diseases that we've got to deal with here. So I think there is a light at the end of the tunnel at this, Fiona. I think we're in, like I said before, in for a couple of tough years as an industry, but we'll come through bigger and stronger, I think, at the other end with all those opportunities laid out before the beekeepers to move forward.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. And I'll add on to the end of that, whilst the beekeeping industry is doing so much to address this with the beekeepers and addressing the health issues affecting the hives, the Bee Friendly Farming Program is really trying to work with the pollination dependent industries to help them build that bridge to better understand what can be done at the landscape level and the farm level to be helping the pollination outcomes. So it's about building those bridges and all of us understanding how we can impact and work together. We obviously, there were questions around bee-friendly farming. I wanted to make sure we put the focus on the topic of today, but there are links in the chat. So I would encourage you to go to the website, have a look at bee-friendly farming, download some powerful pollinator planting guides. There's lots of information, and certainly reach out if you've got any other questions that we can help you with. Thank you very much. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you to Rabobank for writing this report and really putting a spotlight on what, those of us close to the industry know is a really important issue. So thank you to you. Thank you to Tim for coming and sharing your industry's perspective, and also thank you to Danny as well. Really appreciate it. We'll sign off now, and Candice will share a screen so anyone can listen to some music while we're leaving.